the year of 1968 was the year of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Yet the spring and summer of that year not only impacted the world socially, but politically. 1968 was the year of the introduction to the war drafting, the My Lai Massacre, an anti-war and hippie movement, shocking assassinations, and a generation gap which stirred the nation.
I see a red door and I want it painted black. No colors anymore, I want them to turn black.
The Vietnam War was also known as the Second Indochina War. It was a Cold War-era proxy that occurred in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from November 1st, 1955 to April 30th, 1975. But the United States' involvement did not begin until 1961. The war was fought between North Vietnam, who was supported by the Soviet Union, China, and other communist allies, and the government of South Vietnam was supported by the United States and its anti-communist allies. The war showed the American fight against the Soviet Union and the spread of communism. The idea that if one key nation in a region fell to control of communists, the others would fall like toppling dominoes. This was the domino theory. The theory was used by many American leaders to justify American involvement in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was fought mostly by draftees, or people who joined the armed forces through a draft system. These men, considered draftees or enlistees, had no option but to be enrolled in the war. Many people, in fear of being drafted, joined the armed forces voluntarily. People did this mainly so they would be able to choose what service branch they would enter. Men were eligible for the draft at the age of 18. Out of 26.8 million men of the age of 18 during the Vietnam War, 2.2 million were drafted and 8.7 million joined voluntarily. The average age of soldiers fighting in the Vietnam War was 19 years old. The rest of the men who were not drafted enjoyed draft deferments. Most common draft deferment was enrollment at a college or university. College enrollments boomed as young men tried to avoid the draft. Other deferments include having children or teaching in public schools, serving in the U.S. National Guard or Reserves, and certain physical ailments or limitations. Those men apt to get deferments were white and relatively well-off financially. This led to disproportionate numbers of people drafted and a disproportionate number of casualties between races. Sons of the wealthy and those in higher-class families were awarded easy slots in the National Guard or Reserves. The unfairness of the draft system and the draft itself added to the opposition of the Vietnam War among Americans.
005. September 6th. September 6th is 006.
Ron, how many civilians did you actually see shot?
I believe to be about 100. General count, no Pacific count.
The My Lai Massacre was a Vietnam War mass murder on March 16, 1968. The massacre was called the most shocking episode of the Vietnam War. Between 347 and 504 unarmed civilians in South Vietnam were killed. It was committed by the U.S. Army soldiers, and the Vietnamese victims included men, women, children, and infants. Some of the women were gang raped and their bodies mutilated. 26 soldiers were charged with criminal offenses. Only Lieutenant William Calley Jr., a platoon leader, was convicted. He was found guilty of killing 22 villagers. He was originally given a life sentence, but served only 3.5 years under house arrest. The My Lai Massacre increased the domestic opposition to the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, when the scope of killing and cover-up attempts were exposed. Much of the youth culture during the Vietnam War supported peace. Many of these young protesters of the time were impacted somehow either directly or indirectly by the draft. This opposition to the draft was the trigger or main cause to the hippie movements, youth rebellion, peace promotion, and the all-around opposition towards the war. Bands such as The Doors, the Rolling Stones, and the Beatles became popular as the youth population found their songs and albums relatable. The Doors represented a rebellion as they acted as a symbol and representation of the era's new drug culture. Many songs from the Rolling Stones album became popular as they focused on the harshness of the war. The Beatles focused on promotion of peace with their songs, but their song Revolution, released in '68 on their new The White Album, spoke to the rising young generation as it promoted change.
You say you want a revolution, well, you know, we all want to change the world. You tell me that it's evolution, well, you know, we all want to change the world. But when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me?
Abbie Hoffman, a young revolutionist, dedicated his time and efforts working as an American political and social activist and co-founder of the Youth International Party, or the Yippies. In an interview with Hoffman, he shows his support for the youth revolution. His actions and words are remembered as a legacy as he remains a symbol of the youth rebellion of the counterculture era.
What, are you kidding? What are they going to do with it anyway?
Would you have done it?
What?
Would you have taken $100,000 to call everything off?
I would have taken $100,000 as to calling it off. Well,
Well, how much is it worth to you to call it off?
call off
A
what?
million? Would you have done it for $1 million?
Revolution?
Yeah. What's your price?
My life.
You know that it would be untrue. You know that I would be a liar if I was to say to you, girl, we couldn't get much higher. Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire. Try to set the night on fire. The time to hesitate is through. No time to wallow in the mire. Try now, we can only lose, and our love become a funeral pyre. Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire. Try to set the night on fire.
Meanwhile, Senator Robert F. Kennedy was sweeping votes from Democrats across the nation, following in his brother's footsteps in his own presidential campaign. Robert was strongly against the war in Vietnam and openly drew large and enthusiastic crowds when he spoke. In 1968, the senator announced he would run for president. Robert ran on a platform of peace, anti-poverty, civil rights, and social improvements, becoming a hero to all Americans. On June 5, 1968, in Los Angeles, California, Robert had claimed victory in his California's Democratic presidential primary. 30 minutes later, he was transferred to the Hospital of the Good Samaritan for surgery after being shot in the head, leaving his speech.
After John Kennedy's assassination in 1963, Bobby's wilderness years began. He became convinced that America should withdraw from Vietnam. In his presidential bid, removing troops from Vietnam became a priority. He spelled it out in his final interview, given minutes before he was shot.
Had more Americans killed there in the last several weeks than any time during the war. And we're now, 6 months ago, we were talking about bombing Hanoi, and we're concerned about that because we're going to kill civilians. Now we're killing large numbers of them as we bomb Saigon. I just think that we just have to change our policies. And I would hope that the Democratic Party would recognize that.
So, my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you very much.
this area is shot. Seems like Robert Kennedy has been shot.
Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968.